The passage begins with the disciples distracted. At least that's how I read it, almost daydreaming. Their mind is on the beauty, and they're sort of lost in the experience of watching the temple and marveling at its grandeur. And to be fair to the disciples, it would have been a sight to behold. The temple was worthy of their attention. King Herod spent 40 years making it what it was at that point. It was architecturally exquisite. Why do sights like this capture our attention so? Robert was in New York this week, so you saw some pretty incredible architecture, I'm sure. I bet the lights of Times Square. Did you go to Times Square? I bet those lights were overwhelming. We took a family trip to Washington, D.C. earlier this year. Yeah, I don't know what it is precisely. I mean, I think there's an ineffable quality to it. But looking at these incredible structures is arresting, almost. There's the sheer magnitude of them. And there is this realization when you are lost in this marvel that, like, human beings made that. Like, how could that be? We tried to look at all the monuments, but there are a lot. We went to the Washington Monument, and we stood at the base of it, and it's just amazing that something so tall and yet so skinny, like, doesn't fall over. If you get as close to it as you can and you look up, the day we were there were a few clouds in the sky, and I don't know why, but there's this like optical illusion where the clouds move past the monument, and it almost gives this feeling that the world is almost revolving around it. My favorite, though, is the Lincoln Memorial. I like that it takes a little bit of work to get up there to it. Like there's a reward after you climb those steps. There is a ramp, but even the ramp takes a good deal of effort to make it up there. It's visually stunning to see the statue of Honest Abe. And if you've never seen it before in person, then you have seen it either in media outlets or textbooks. We're all familiar with it. And so there's something really cool about finally seeing it in person. And there's the history that's attached to it, I think, that grabs us. Above the statue, it reads, "In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever." If you look at the south wall of the Lincoln Memorial, you see the words of the Gettysburg Address. And I decided I'm going to read that, and I want you to listen to it. I think for many of you, if you're anything like me, it's been a long time since you have done that. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they fought here, have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. It is a beautiful speech, of course, and it so elegantly captures our story, and it, in fact, reminds us that we are a part of that story and that it is still unfolding. The memorial inspires us to be better, to stand up for the principles of equality, to speak out against tyranny, and to fight when the moment calls for it. Words can't quite express the deep meaning behind it in our relationship to it. What would it be like for your trusted teacher to tell you that the Lincoln Memorial, for instance, was to crumble, that it will all be thrown down? How would it feel to hear that and believe it? With the memorial itself, wouldn't a sense of hope crumble with it? The temple is not just a pretty building. The disciples are not merely distracted by its aesthetics. It's more even than a place of worship. It is, to quote the New Interpreter's Commentary in my study Bible, the social, religious, and political center of the Jewish world. There is history behind it, too. Just think of the story and scriptures, all that the Jewish people have endured. So many times they lost everything, and then somehow God gets them out. There's this ebb and flow, this cyclical sense. God makes a promise to Abraham that he shall father a great nation that exceeds the number of stars in the sky. And in the latter parts of the book of Genesis, we see the story of how that happens, how so many of these chosen people get in conflict with each other and even kill each other, how there are all these struggles with faith, and how it seems like there's no way that they'll be able to populate this great nation as many matriarchs and patriarchs grow old and age. But by the end, one of the great conflicts is resolved, and Joseph and his brothers find peace. And it feels like it's happily ever after until you open the first verse of the next book and find what? That the people are enslaved in Egypt. The ebbs and the flows. They're in Egypt, and through great struggle and through another series of ups and downs, God frees them. But then they're trapped in the wilderness for 40 years. God does lead them to the promised land, but once they get there, there are a whole set of new challenges, and they have to engage in this complex espionage and even battle. Once they're settled, they have to figure out how to govern. They struggle through that for a while, and somehow they land on the system of monarchy, which mostly is great while it lasts. Eventually we have King David, the greatest king who ever lived, and his son Solomon, his successor, builds the most incredible temple, showing the world that the Jewish people had overcome these great challenges, all those threats to their existence. The temple is proof that God is with them. Because if they had remained in Egypt, or if they had died in the wilderness, or if they had been killed by the Canaanites, or if they had never figured out how to organize and govern themselves, don't you understand? There would be no temple if not for all those struggles leading up to it. Well, within a couple of decades, 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel secede, forming what comes to be called the Northern Kingdom, or the Kingdom of Israel. The Southern Kingdom is the Kingdom of Judah. North and South. There's all sorts of historical rhyming, if you're paying attention, it seems to me. Well, 200 years of this arrangement, and the Assyrians invade the north, and a couple centuries after that, the Babylonians invade the south, and there are these great exiles, and the Jewish people face this crisis of identity and survival, and Solomon's temple falls. Well, about 70 years after exile, the Persian king Cyrus takes power and allows the Babylonian prisoners to return home. The Assyrians never actually officially free the northerners from those 10 tribes, and they would never be the same. When they return, again, under Cyrus's Persian rule, he allows them to rebuild the temple, but it's quite modest, nothing like Solomon's. And then there is this period called the intertestamental period, where power goes from the Persians and Cyrus to the Greeks to the Romans, and that's when the next chapter begins. The Romans agree to allow Herod to expand this modest temple into something grand. According to the historian Josephus, Herod believed this expansion would, quote, assure his eternal remembrance. It was a sight to behold. And you'll notice that it's a bit complicated, and that temple expansion would not be there unless Rome said it could be. But nevertheless, please know that temple meant something to the people. That temple embodies all the ups and downs, the exiles, the battles, the periods of triumph and despair. The whole complicated history brought them to this place where they could finally have a proper temple, and they could have hope, and they could be reminded that God was with them. Of course, it was devastating when Jesus told them that the temple would fall, that not one stone would be left upon another, that the whole thing would be thrown down. Now, I don't want to be cavalier about it or somehow minimize the magnitude of what Jesus is saying. But in light of the historical perspective, zooming way out, maybe even taking on an eternal perspective, maybe we realized the temple was going to fall sooner or later. It turns out Jesus was right in his prediction, because during a conflict in which the Jews tried to revolt against Rome, Herod's temple does fall in 70 AD, some 4 decades after today's scripture takes place. I asked you earlier how it would feel, just as an example, to learn that, say, the Lincoln Memorial would fall. It's not a perfect analogy, but I asked you to consider what that would feel like. Well, the bad news is it will fall. One way or another. I hope I'm not around to see it, and I hope that it falls when Jesus returns and there's a new world. It seems to me that as long as there is hope for a better America, as long as there is some semblance of a baseline of what it means to live in a civil society, we can at least agree on that. Our symbols, the physical, cultural markers that unify us as a people, that remind us of the sacrifices of our ancestors, they do still seem intact, thanks be to God. But the truth is, we don't know how long they'll last. In the end, the Lincoln Memorial is an artificial structure created, built by human beings. You might have noticed that Jesus didn't tell the disciples exactly when the temple would fall. We can deduce from his teachings that the time is relatively near and that there will be signs, he tells us, cataclysmic signs, wars and insurrections, famines, plagues, nations against nations, earthquakes. On one hand, we see, oh man, that's going to be so awful when that happens. But on the other, we can't help but notice that these things are happening today all around the world, and they feel like they're getting worse. The truth is, the hard truth, is that we don't know when eras will come to an end until they're over. Times of peace and times of prosperity, times of despair and hardship. But what we do know is that eventually everything comes to an end except for the kingdom of God. And when we experience these endings, you could even call them death, if you like. It's just about the most painful thing that humans have to deal with. I remember watching the news on January the 6th, 2021, with my wife and my then 1.5-year-old Edie. Thomas wasn't born yet. And watching in real time as the U.S. Capitol was desecrated. Of course, I was a pastor during this time, and you'll remember what it was like then. In some ways, it's not much different now. In some ways, it is. And I tried really hard to encourage dialogue in my church, and there were other churches around doing this, and we would set up these opportunities for people to come together and talk about their feelings about world events and to try and build dialogue. There was one guy in my church who was younger, and he did this with me, and we agreed on almost nothing, actually, but we were able to have civil conversation, and we listened to each other, and we felt closer to each other after having done that. It was dialogue just the way that it's meant to be, and it gave me this sense of hope during this tragically divisive time. And I just remember when we were watching the news that day and we saw these people breaking windows and going into the actual chamber of Congress and pushing things down, that I got a text message from this friend. And I'll still call him a friend, but it was gloating about what he was observing and bragging and saying, "No votes will be counted today." And I just remember just losing this sense of reality, wondering if anything was worth trying to make things right in this broken world. It felt hopeless. The Capitol still stands, but something else died that day, and I don't know when we'll get it back. The natural question in light of all this is, why? Why must temples fall? Why is everything temporary? What are we supposed to do when it feels like all sense of hope has been robbed? Why should we bother keeping going? Well, I know it's about to be Advent and not Easter, but the Christian answer is always to turn to the cross. Jesus died on the cross, and you should be sure that that death marks a distinct ending. Jesus cries out from the cross, showing us that it's an ending. "I thirst," he says. my God, why have you forsaken me?" he says. And of course, it is finished. It took what must have been an eternity for the disciples, a long and painful 3 days before he rose again. But please be assured that he did. You see, ingrained in creation is this pattern: endings leading to beginnings, death providing opportunities for resurrection. And the great temptation, you see, is to stop at the death part because it feels so overwhelming, so engrossing. The great temptation is to stop at death and to give up. It's really so easy to give up. It is. You don't even have to try to give up. It's so easy to say things like, "What difference could I make anyway? What is the point in trying?" We believe in salvation by grace through faith. That means there's a reason to keep trying. That means that one moment of death, though it feels all-consuming, is simply that: one moment in a much bigger scheme. Maybe in those moments it will be helpful to zoom out and take on that eternal perspective. The good news is resurrection is coming. It is even unfolding in this very moment. It's not easy to see it. It's not easy to take part in it. Sometimes it even feels absurd. But we are Christians. And one of our distinct traits is that we put faith in a God whose love is bigger than whatever this world might throw at us. So we're not meant to give up or to sit back and watch. God calls us to jump in the middle of it, to be a part of the resurrection. Thanks be to God.